This is part one of a Voron V0.2 build series that uses the Siboor CNC kit. This first video covers the frame build. So to start this off, I am essentially just going by the Voron Zero assembly manual. Uh, it's it's the best way to go. It's the most complete documentation. Some things to really sort of watch out for. Obviously, we don't have to drill extrusion because it's a kit. This is all pre-drilled and pre-tapped for us. Uh, Take a look, and I would organize the different types of extrusion that exist. There are some differences slightly, and I'll get to that in a minute. The other thing is you don't actually have to use these nut holders because it's got tapped pieces of metal that are going to slide into the railing, which we'll see in a minute, and they look similar to this. And of course, please make sure you're paying really close attention to the holes that are drilled into the extrusion, or if they give you a measurement, obvious that you follow it. And then the drop nuts. Um, in the case of these, I did not use drop nuts. They didn't really feel necessary, but the drop nuts that exist out there are really for a different kind of extrusion. None of them would fit these. I started to design some new ones, but it turned out the nuts fit in here really kind of nice and easy. The other thing you need to pay attention to is Siboor also has a little bit of extra documentation here that shows you where things differ from the official manual. That said, as you go through the official manual, you'll find there are a few other things that differ as well, but it's really not a big deal and it's pretty easy to identify. Also, in preparation for the build, the kit comes with these spacers to help center the rails on the extrusion. And if you notice here, in my case, they seem to be a little bit loose. And I was having a little bit of issues there, and so I decided to go ahead and reprint them myself. And make sure you check this before you go ahead and use it. And notice the ones I just printed here are actually quite tight. And it's really not a big deal. I think it's really great foresight that they actually, Siboor actually included those pre-printed. But at least for me, these seem to work a little better. You might not have an issue, but it's just something to be aware of and check. Another thing, when setting up the Z axis for the V0.2, the Voron manual asked that these bars, the extrusion, are spaced about 58 millimeters from the side, if I remember correctly. And so to make that a little easier, I printed these blocks. I just designed these in Tinkercad really quick, threw them together, and printed these out. And they made aligning this rail a whole lot easier. I've included the link to the STL for this up above. But again, here you can see me using it, and it worked out really well. Also notice I'm using an engineer square up there, and I find these really useful as well. It's not necessary, but if you have a few, it wouldn't be a bad idea to pull them out. There's also a part of this build where the back side of the printer, where the extrusion needs to be spaced exactly 37 millimeters. In fact, it asks you to measure it twice. So again, in Tinkercad, I created these super quick. It only took a couple of minutes. These spacer blocks that I could use to really measure this easily. I'm showing you this here on a wooden table, but I actually did it on a glass table to make sure it was accurate. And you can see here how the blocks go in. And it, again, just kind of simplified really the setup of this, the measuring, and making sure everything was flat. From my perspective, probably in addition to the rails being perfectly straight, you really need to make sure the extrusion is correct and everything is square if you want to have trouble-free printing in the future. So I've got the links to these STLs above as well, and you can choose to print these or not, but I found it definitely helped the build go smoother. So to start, we're going to assemble the Y rails. Make sure you collect your nut bars. Make sure you connect the extrusions with the proper holes. Make sure you double check in the manual to make sure you get this right. Make sure you have lubed your linear guides and you've got the right screws and the spacers. And again, in this case, I actually printed my own spacers just to make sure things were tight, but to check it first. And so as you see here, simply take the nut bar and slide it in. It really can't get easier than this, which is great. So now place the linear guide on the extrusion, and here I'm just going to very slightly, lightly put in a screw. And then apply the spacers, I should say. And then I go ahead and insert the other screws. For the most part, it's skipping every other hole, starting from the center, although the two center screws are inserted. And then when we tighten these down, we want to start from the middle and then go out to the edge. That way, if there's any curve or anything like that in the rail, it will be taken care of by how we tighten these. So right here, I'm just doing them really loosely, and then we'll go from there. The manual states that one end of the rail needs to be 38, or one end of the guide needs to be 38 millimeters from the end of the extrusion. And so here I simply measured out the 38 millimeters using my calipers, and then I locked it. And here I am checking to make sure it's 38 millimeters. And here I'm starting from the center and then tightening the screws as I move out. And once you've done one side, you do the other. Once you've done that, quick little check, make sure things are moving nicely. And again, make sure you lube these before you put them on. You may need to clean them as well, but mine were really clean. I simply added the lubrication. And once you're done with that rail, you can go ahead and start the second Y rail. Once that's done, go ahead and install the rail stops at the end, just to make sure your carriage doesn't slide off the end and lose any ball bearings. And this is super easy. Next, we assemble the Z rails, and this is where the bed mount will attach to. Make sure you check the documentation and you've got the correct extrusions with the holes in the right place. And so simply insert these. I don't tighten these fully. I'm only inserting these two bolts, which will eventually be tightened down, just to help in terms of alignment of all the screws that'll go in later. We still have to center these rails on the extrusion before they get tightened down. So then use the centering tools, the 3D printed centering tools here, and make sure The one end here is 33 millimeters away from the end of the extrusion. Now I ended up redoing these a little bit later. I noticed later there was a little bit of play in these tools versus the extrusion and the rail. And so I ended up 3D printing these two parts again. I mean, they're beautifully printed, but for whatever reason, in my case, it was just, there was a little bit of play. So make sure you tighten the screws from the center heading outward, or at least as, again, recommended by the documentation. And they should be good to go. And then we install the carriage stops, which is simple enough. Next, we set up the Z-frame. Start off by making sure the bolts are inserted on each end. And then, as all over the place, we need to preload these nuts, and in this case, two. So while I'm handling this, I don't want these nuts to slide out and fall out, and especially if I don't notice it, it's going to be a major pain. So I'm just inserting some screws here. I'm not torquing it down, just enough to hold the nuts in place so they don't fall off as I handle this. And then, of course, we prepare the other extrusion, and I'm doing the same thing with the nuts. Again, these screws in these nuts are temporary. And again, please make sure as you build this, you check, you double check, and then you triple check the preloading of nuts. Trust me, you don't want to find out later after you've mostly assembled this to find out you've missed some. You're going to end up disassembling major portions of this printer. I did it multiple times, and just pay really close attention. These aren't in the final locations, so it's just tight enough to hold. You don't have to torque these down. We still have to get these in the proper position. That'll happen in a few minutes. So we're just attaching these extrusions on the sides, now temporary. We'll tighten these down enough to hold it all together, but this is going to help us with positioning, and these are going to be coming off later. I'm using squares here. I don't know if it's really necessary. In fact, I don't think it's necessary. But for me, I find it easier to make sure everything's flush and everything's at 90 degrees as it needs to be. I find it a help. Use them if you think you need them. All right, so I had mostly assembled the frame of this printer when I realized I was having a really hard time with the bed because I could not get these rails straight. And so part of it was the spacing. So please notice here the carriages are not on the rails. Do not take the carriages off your rails. I decided instead of disassembling other parts of the printer that this was easier. You should not need to do this. In this case, as I mentioned earlier, I 3D printed these spacers to make sure at least one of these was parallel and spaced properly. And then the second rail is spaced once the carriages and the bed holder and everything else is attached. I apologize, I lost some of that video, so I had to resort to this. But you can see how these 3D printed blocks help in terms of consistent and even spacing here. And I found the end result was definitely better, at least better than I was capable of doing. You may have other and better options. And then, of course, we add the carriage stops. So now we start construction of the bed mount. And in this case, we're getting ready for the cable chain just by taking the end off and bolting it in place. And then the bed carrier. And then we preload nuts again. And again, I'm just using these screws just to keep it tight enough to stop them from falling out. We'll be using it soon enough. and these are preloads as well. And yet, more preloads. Then we continue construction of the bed mount, or the Z-axis. And we're simply mounting these CNC aluminum parts to the carriages. It's 4 bolts. And one goes through the access hole. You want these tight, but you don't want to over tighten. If you over tighten, they will actually bend the carriage, and it will make the rail a little less reliable, a little less accurate. It could introduce some play, or the opposite, tighten things up. So again, just firm, but don't over tighten. So a little bit of sarcasm here when I say this was the fun part. I used a tie here and to help move the nut over to align the hole. What you just saw me do there, use a really small Allen wrench to sort of help center the nut there within the hole. Sometimes I mess up, as you see right here. And again, moving it over, centering it within the hole so I can insert the screw and get it into the nut. And it's a little bit tricky, but it's not that hard either. It's definitely doable. And of course, you've got to get 4 of these done here, 1 per side. Again, there are probably better ways of doing this. It's a little irritating, but it works. It is doable. And this actually didn't take very long to get done. Just a little bit of persistence. And again, got to get 2 screws in here, 2 per side. If it's sounding quiet here, it's not because there's a problem with your audio. I started to find the changes to the sounds because I'm playing this video at double speed to be a little bit irritating, and so I decided to just get rid of it. I put music, but I've tried music in the past and it just seemed to get people angry. So I'm just going to go with quiet. Hopefully you're okay with it. Please leave a comment if you think it's a problem. And here I am, just making sure the screws are tight and everything is firm. And it works. One other thing, this isn't the normal space I work on. It's a thick glass table that's super flat. And again, if you can do something like that, I think it's fairly important. Between that and the squares, at least I feel it helps me get a reasonably aligned and flat surface. Here, I'm going ahead and I am installing the end stop, the Z end stop. And again, this is a CNC aluminum part, which is really nice. The switch came pre-wired. I believe all I had to do was bolt it into this holder, and then, of course, bolt it in here to the Z-axis. And once you do, check it just to make sure you can hear the switch clicking. If not, you may have to make some adjustments, but it's a pretty easy adjustment and it's a pretty easy install. It works. And now here I am taking out the temporary extrusions, and as we start to move on to the rest of this build. And then take the other side off. So here I am preloading where I can, and I've said it multiple times. Please check the manual as you build and make sure you're getting these in the right places. Um, Otherwise, you'll pay the price later. And so now we're going on to try and complete the frame. And here are the extrusions that are supposed to be there. I'm not sure the square is really working here or really helping me any. Um, Although at some point here I'll grab it in a second. Truthfully, the extrusions, or they all seem to be cut perfectly. This Siboor kit, so far from what I've been building, I cannot complain. All the extrusions were high quality. They were anodized on the ends, which was really kind of nice. I was not expecting that. And everything so far seems to be cut as it should be. I'm pretty sure if you didn't use these squares, you could just bolt it as you would normally, and they would be perpendicular to each other as you would expect. So I'm putting these screws in tight enough to hold everything together and for the most part hold everything in place. But these are not torqued down very much. You can actually with a little bit of effort, move them out of place by twisting or turning on them. I figured I would try to get everything aligned before I really start to tighten things down. And all I'm doing here is adding the screws here because we have another extrusion that's about to be added as we move forward to complete the frame. And check with the Voron documentation to make sure, again, you're putting the right pieces in here. Make sure the holes and everything are all in the right place. I am doing this on a glass table, ideally in an effort to get the ends completely flush with the other extrusion. You see it rocking here a little bit. It's not because of the extrusion. It's actually the linear guide, the carriage here on the backside. So although I said I'm using a glass table here, I'm not sure how much it's helping at this point in time. But the glass table, or in this case, the square, will definitely help if you align from the other end, not the end where the carriages are. So for the spacing of the bottom, I mentioned earlier, I had pre-printed these 37 millimeter blocks. I'll have links to the STL for these. And as you can see here, I simply place them in each corner. And again, the screws or the bolts are slightly loose. And this will allow me to sort of push down on a reasonably flat surface. I actually ended up doing this on the glass table as well. Um, Although right here you don't see me doing that. And so there, that way I can push down. I can make sure everything's where it needs to be. It's actually, well, it's actually the side extrusions that need to be pushed down. Everything's aligned. You can tighten it down and then get rid of the blocks. And then here I'm inserting the base panel. And there you get a close-up, take a look, see how it fits in, and especially against the Z end stop switch. And again, adding more screws here for the rest of the frame. And I'm preloading nuts here for the rest of the frame. And there's quite a few of these. These are the ones on the bottom. And I'm just following the manual. insert the last extrusion for the base. You may have to adjust the depth of the screws here a little bit to make this work right. I think at this point it really just comes down to aligning everything properly so it all fits in. Quite honestly, it's really quite easy to build. In my case, using the square to make sure everything seems like, well, it's square and flush. So now I'm using the measuring tape and I'm measuring all the diagonals and they should be equal or at least within a millimeter of each other. In my case, everything seemed to be right on or slightly less than a millimeter within each other, which I deemed accurate enough. But it's really good to check just to make sure nothing's wrong. I mean, I used a square throughout. It should be straight, but still, it's worth checking. It'll give you the last bit of assurance. Also, make sure none of the extrusions are slightly twisted or turned. In some cases, it could be, and if so, I would go ahead, loosen things a little bit, and straighten everything out. You really want everything to be exactly perpendicular as it should be to each other, and make sure everything's within check.